Hey everyone, how's it going? Forrest here, again with another installment of my complete analysis of all of Bach's chorale harmonizations. Terwilligen nun liebe Ziel, nun ist es Zeit, which translates to, Arise, my soul, thy voice employ. This is an interesting chorale for sure, lots of twists and turns, some unconventional harmony as well, so we're just going to hop right into it because I anticipate this one's going to be on the longer side. 3 sharps in the key signature, we start on F sharp minor, we end on A major. I reckon the overall tonality of this chorale is A major, and we just start on a 6 chord, or a 4-6 chord, depending on whether you hear this D as the chord tone or this C sharp. I'm just writing it as a 6 chord because the chords are more or less identical to one another, but both analyses are accurate in this context, I believe. We then have C sharp, E, E, and A. Some interesting stuff going on. The alto feels like we're in E major. Tenor also sort of clarifies that as well, or justifies it. Also has ideas of A major in it. The bass feels like F sharp minor, and the melody feels like A major. So there's some interesting ideas regarding what key each individual line is when you isolate them, but I think all in all the aggregate just comes out to be A major. So this is A major in first inversion, 1-6, passing tone in the alto before we get B, D, G sharp, and E. This is E7 over B, which is 5-4-3. We have some passing tones in 3 of the voices here, A, C sharp, A, and E. It's our tonic triad. A major is a passing chord. 5 wants to go to 1. Bach is definitely subdividing the harmonic rhythm here. Before we get E major again, E, B, B, and E, or sorry, G sharp, B, B, and E. E, B, B, and E would be a very interesting chord, but this is 5-6, E major in first inversion. And then we resolve where we would expect A, E, and D, but this D is a 4-3 suspension or an accented non-chord tone above the bass. This is an A major chord, and if you look ahead, we get a couple of G naturals, and Bach did this in a chorale not too long ago as well, where he shifted from a key to D major unexpectedly and to justify the G naturals. I believe we were moving from the key of F sharp minor. I don't have those notes in front of me, but I do believe we move to the key of D major here, and we get this interesting chord progression here, and I think A is our gateway to this mid-phrase modulation because A is also 5 in the key of D major. And then we get G natural as a passing tone here, but before that we get D sharp. So G natural and D sharp, one might think that we're in the key of E minor, and I definitely played around with the idea of E minor, but we don't have D sharp and C sharp going up towards E, so there's no melodic minor that would justify, I think, E minor being the proper analysis in this case. I tried analyzing it in E minor and it works up until a point, but I think D major makes a little bit more sense here, and we just have some interesting secondary harmony going on here. So we would expect 5 to go to 1, but the resolution is prolonged. We have A, B, D sharp, and B, and I think this is an incomplete secondary dominant chord, 5-4-2 of 2, because B is the dominant of E, and E is our 2 in the key of D major. I suppose you could also analyze this as a G augmented triad, like some type of interesting borrowed chord from E minor, I suppose, but that's, I think, counterpoint going on here. The G natural against the D sharp creates very interesting counterpoint, that augmented fourth. But then we get F sharp, A, E, and C sharp, so we don't get the immediate resolution. In fact, we don't get the resolution at all. We get resolution to F sharp minor, which is kind of unusual and doesn't really make a lot of sense here. But this D sharp going to E does resolve where we would expect it to, the leading tone at least, or the secondary leading tone. We just don't really get the chord entirely intact. So this F sharp minor 7 chord would be 3-7. Even in terms of E minor, this wouldn't even be a deceptive progression because we keep the C sharp going on here in the melody. Definitely very unusual. I suppose we could be In the key of, no, because we have F sharps, so it's difficult to really know exactly what's going on here. I hear it in the key of D major the more that I listen to it with the G naturals, and the D sharp here I feel is just explainable as a secondary leading tone that just doesn't ever fully get resolved. Granted, we do have some neighbor tones here in the bass that, in the lower voices rather, that are E and G natural, which do make up the majority of the 2 chord we would expect. However, with this C sharp sustained in the melody, this leaves us not with E minor, even though the majority of the chord is there, but rather C sharp diminished over E, which is 7/6. So 3 going to 7, that's some transitive harmony. We do see it with some frequency in Bach, but I think it's more common to see 4 go to 7, but that's okay. Because we do get D major on the other side of it, we actually do get a normative resolution, F sharp, A, D, and D, which is 1/6, and also where I believe we're going back to the key of A major. This is now 4/6, and the chord kind of gets turned into root position on the and of the beat, but we do get rid of the third in the process, and we also have a passing 7th, so don't feel it's very imperative to analyze it, or at least put it on the page. But then we do turn that D major mid-phrase escapade into the predominant of our A major perfect authentic cadence. We have E, E, G sharp, and B. That's our 5 chord, E major, passing 7th in the tenor, and then we cadence on A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad. Okay, looking ahead to the next phrase, and before we get started, apologies for the eraser marks. I found that there was an error in my notes and I need to go back and correct my analysis, but we have the phrase straightened out now, so things are good. We end in a perfect authentic cadence in the key of E major, but we stay in A major for about half of the length of the phrase, a little bit longer than half, I believe. We start things off with D major, D, A, F sharp, and A, which is our 4 chord. And then we see a chain, or something that's going to start a chain of a similar set of progressions. We have D sharp, A, F sharp, and B, which is B7 over D sharp. That's 5, 6, 5 of 5, because B is the dominant of E, and E is our 5. And then E is suspended here in the bass. It creates a syncopation with the tenor and the melody, and it just offsets what the bass is. The bass is offset by an 1/8 note, half of the beat. But then when we look on this beat, we have E, G sharp, E, and not B, which is what we would expect, but C sharp. So we have a very similar thing to what's going on here, except for we're dealing with G naturals in this phrase here, but similar gesture, just different accidentals. We're going to C sharp minor, which in first inversion, which in the key of A major is 3/6, but in terms of E major, this is a secondary deceptive progression, 5/6/5 going to 6 in E major terms. So we see secondary progressions in Bach from time to time, like 5 of, what would it be, like 5 of, we see when that 5 of 2 going to 4, things like that. We see secondary deceptive progressions with frequency in Bach, actually. It's one of his common sort of turnaround, delayed resolution progressions that we see. But looking ahead, we're setting up for another one as well. Bach sneaks in kind of a little bit of an implied, actually this C sharp is a chord tone, it's the E sharp that isn't. We have E sharp, G sharp, C sharp, and C sharp, and raising this bass by a half step does change the function of the chord to 5, 6 of 6, because C sharp is the dominant of F sharp, and F sharp is our submediate. And before immediately going to that chord, because of what I guess the suspension in the bass does, we get E sharp, B, G sharp, and D, which is a root position, fully diminished 7th chord, E sharp diminished, which is just another secondary dominant in terms of 6. It's 7, 7 of 6. So we have a little bit of a sustained tension here, a sustained secondary tension before we don't get our exact resolution. Again, the lower voices hint at it, F sharp, A, and F sharp, but the melody is what changes the resolution. So on the offbeat, we have D major in first inversion, which is 4, 6. And again, this is a secondary deceptive progression in terms of in terms of F sharp minor, because D major is the 6 of F sharp minor, and here we have 7 going to 6, or 5 going to 6, the idea of the dominant going somewhere other than the tonic. But moving ahead, we do have G sharp, B, E, and B, which starts a chain to look as if we're going to resolve on A major at some point, but we never quite get it because this is our gateway to the key of E major. It's now our tonic in root position. This A is a neighbor tone, this D sharp is a neighbor tone, and this sort of harkens back to a chord we saw earlier. We had A, B, D sharp, and B. It's actually spelled the exact same way, and I feel inclined to analyze it. However, in this case, it's actually going to resolve where we expect it to, which is interesting that we're seeing the chord reference later and actually getting the resolution rather than earlier when there was, I guess, really no reason. But Bach didn't leave a precedent for us to believe that the resolution wouldn't have come then and there. But we do get the resolution here, G sharp, B, E, and E, similar to the chord that we have before. This is 1-6, root position, or sorry, first inversion. The 4-2 chord resolves where we would expect, and we kind of get a root position version of the chord on the and here, but it's not entirely intact. This F sharp gets introduced, and the B is removed. Because this E turns into a suspension near the cadence. Bach gets very contrapuntal near cadences, especially in the chorales, so I'm hesitant to analyze this as the 1-6 going to 1 in root position. And then again, it doesn't really contribute too much to the chord progression, so I'm going to leave it off of the page. It's going to help me real estate-wise too. We have B, E, A, and F sharp. This E is a 4-3 suspension over the bass, and where one might analyze this as 5-7, I think that's a totally accurate analysis in its own right. By the time the E gets introduced, or sorry, by the time the E gets resolved, we have B, D sharp, F sharp, and F sharp, no more 7th. So I'm just going to analyze this as a plain old 5 chord. 5 or 5-7, it's fairly negligible because they're both functioning the same way. They're basically the same chord. And then we cadence on E major, E, E, G sharp, and B, which is our tonic triad in root position. Okay, looking ahead, we have a half cadence in the key of A major, and I think this entire phrase is in the key of A major. This is one of those perfect authentic cadences, or just authentic cadences in general, in the key of the dominant that just ends up being the dominant of the next phrase. So in this case, E is now 5, and then we are off to the races in the key of A major. A, E, A, and C sharp is our tonic, passing 7th in the bass. F sharp, A, and C sharp is F sharp minor, which is our 6th chord. And then we have a passing 7th in the bass. This is also a passing 7th. If I did not mention that, I forgot if I did. Passing tone in the melody as well. Before we get B, F sharp, A sharp, sorry, I keep on mixing up my clefs. D, F sharp, A sharp, and E. This is an interesting chord. I reckon this D is an accented non-chord tone, and instead what we have is C sharp, F sharp, A sharp, and E, which is F sharp 7 over C sharp. That's another secondary dominant. That would be 5-4-3 of, let's see, F sharp is the dominant of B, so it would be 5-4-3 of 2. Another secondary dominant of 2, this time it's in the key of A major, and it resolves where we expect it to. We have B, F sharp, B, and D. B minor, which is our 2 chord, passing 7th in the alto as well, before we get E, E, G sharp, and C sharp, again with Bach tricking us with with sort of like a false sense of expectation here. We're expecting to go to 5. The lower voices spell out 5 for us, but instead we get 3-6 C sharp minor over E. And for all intents and purposes, 3 is a substitute for 5 as well because they share most of their tones in common. But here we have our expectations sort of busted here. But if we take an aggregate of everything that's going on this beat, both sets of eighth notes, we kind of can get an E major chord here, but because the E major chord is interrupted by this F sharp here, along with this passing 7th, it leaves us with a chord that isn't really analyzable. We have D, F sharp, B, and E, some type of sus chord there. But looking ahead, we go from 3-6 to, interestingly, 1-6, C sharp, E, E, and A. 3 going to 1 relatively unusual progression. Thirds progressions are amongst the least common progressions we see in Bach. A thirds progression being a chord whose root goes from whose root is a third away from the next chord, and they're more commonly seen in descending fashion. So unlike 6 going to 1, we usually see 1 going to 6, and I guess 3 going to 1 as well, but it's a very uncommon chord. But interestingly, we do see this 1-6 chord turn into a subdivided progression that we see quite frequently in Bach. We have B, D, F sharp, and B, and where one might be tempted to call this a 2 chord, I'm going to wrap this with 2 parentheses because it's happening on the offbeat in a secondary analysis. I reckon this F sharp's an accented non-chord tone. I guess in the context it's like a double accented non-chord tone because it's a non-chord tone of a set of non-chord tones here, because all of these should be marked. It's this G sharp that I think is contributing to what's happening here, and I think this is actually 7, 6, and if you've seen my videos or have analyzed this progression yourself, chances are you know what's happening on the next beat. We're getting A major in root position, A, C sharp, A, and C sharp. 2 roots and 2 thirds, but still an A major chord. 1, 6, 7, 6, 1, or the reverse, 1, 7, 6, 1, 6. Very common chord progression in Bach. It's a pattern that we see a lot, even applied to different pairs of chords as well, like 4, 3, 6, 4, 6, or 3, 2, 6, 3, 6. The pattern, you get it. It's a set of 2 chords with the same root, and the chord that separates them is a chord that's a diatonic step below in first inversion. And then, interestingly, connecting the 1 and the 5 chord here, E, E, G sharp, and B is a set of non-chord tones. D sharp's a passing tone. F is, what's that? I guess that might be an appoggiatura. But it's a non-chord tone. We have D sharp, F sharp, A, and C sharp, which is D sharp minor 7 flat 5 over A, which would be 7, 4, 3 of 5, acting as our predominant here. Secondary dominant, which resolves the way we would expect, but this is still definitely a half cadence. We've not modulated to the key of E. I'm very firm on that one. Okay, looking ahead, we have an imperfect authentic cadence in the key of B minor. Bach has followed this interesting set of short phrases followed by a longer contrapuntal final phrase for the last couple of chorales now. I wonder if there's any significance behind that. But we are going to move to the key of B minor relatively quickly. I think this A major is still in the key of A, E, A, and C sharp, which is our tonic triad, passing 7th in the alto, and then we get D major, D, D, F sharp, and A, which is our 4 chord, and consequently our gateway to the key of B minor. It's now our 3 chord. This E is a neighbor tone, this C sharp is a neighbor tone. We kind of have the idea of like a minor 5-ish going on here, but I don't really hear it that way. I just think that the bass is just, or the lower voices rather, are moving. We then have D, D, F sharp, and B. Another 3 to 1, 6 progression. Very interesting. We're seeing, well, this is 3, 6 to 1, 6. But we have 3 to 1, 6 here as well, which is interesting because 3 and 1, the same way that 3 and 5 are related by 2 tones, 3 and 1 are also related by 2 tones. So it's not very progressional in terms of the chord because, well, we have 2 tones in common. So the progression is relatively static in terms of the tones that are being introduced. But afterwards, we get a very similar chord progression to what we precede our half cadence with here. If we take a look at the subdivision, we have C sharp, E, G sharp, and C sharp, which could potentially be like a 2 minor chord, but I think this G sharp, the same way that this F sharp here is a non-chord tone. I suppose you could call this a 2 chord like I just said, but and I'll double wrap it in parentheses. I think this is actually 7-6, and that's what creates the imperfect authentic quality of this cadence. We have B, F sharp, B, and D, B minor to end things off. So 1, 7, 1, 6, 7, 6, 1, 6, 1, 6, 7, 6, 1, 6. It's a pattern that we see a lot in Bach. Or if you're adamant about analyzing these as 2 chords, 1, 6, 2, 1, 6. It's just the flip side of the just depends on how you analyze it. It might just be semantics for some. I feel like it makes more sense to have a dominant in between the two tonic triads though, so that's just me. And by dominant, I mean not a 5 chord, a dominant functioning chord, one that wants to resolve to the tonic typically speaking, or to a tonic functioning chord. Okay, looking ahead, we have a perfect authentic cadence in the key of D major, and B minor is going to be our gateway to the key of D major right out the bat. That is a 6 chord now in the key of D major, and then we're going to get another 6 going to 3 chord, which I feel like we saw earlier. I might be crazy, but I feel like we saw this chord progression earlier to some extent. No, I think I'm crazy. If you spot it, or if you've already spotted it and I'm just not seeing it, that's okay. I might just be confusing this because I've already looked at the chorale. We have F sharp, A, and C sharp. Again, that's a 3 chord, F sharp minor, passing 7th in the tenor this time. And then we get G, D, B, and B, which is our 4 chord, G major, passing 7th in the bass, passing tone in the alto, before we get E, E, G natural, and C sharp. Again, this G natural being used here makes me feel like this analysis in the key of D major is all the more accurate, because Bach has been throwing G naturals into sort of A major, F sharp minor textures recently, or I guess not recently. This music has existed for hundreds of years, but in the proportionate to the chorales as I've been looking at them. But this is C sharp diminished over E. It's a 7/6 chord, and then we cadence on D major, D, A, F sharp, and D. It's always interesting to see an authentic cadence or a perfect authentic cadence that goes from 7 to 1, but typically when we see 7 going to 1, it's preceded by a 4 chord. So really 4/7/1 is just the less common version of 2/5/1. But going into our last phrase, as contrapuntal as this section is, I really do think there's actually not too many chords going on here, at least that are entirely intact to the point that we can analyze it. You could really nitpick this chorale and be very granular and say, well, all of these inner voices, or all of the voices that are moving while 2 of the voices stay static, are implying chords, but a lot of them aren't going to make it onto the page because the entire chord is not intact. So that's typically my MO. But moving ahead, I do think this D is our gateway, the same way that the previous phrase, our first chord, was our gateway back to the next key. This D major chord is now our 4 chord. Let me go ahead and make that 4 look less like an N. Our 4 chord. Somehow that kind of looks more like an N. That's okay, we know it's a 4 chord. And we go immediately to A, E, and C sharp. Tonic triad, root position. This A is a chord tone, we don't need to analyze it. We then have E, B, A, and B, but this G sharp we know is our chord tone. This A is just a 4/3 suspension over the bass. That's just a 5 chord. And then we get A, C sharp, G sharp, and A. Very interestingly here, I think this G sharp is a 7/6 suspension over the bass, but what ends up happening, or I guess it's not even really a 7/6 suspension over the bass, it's like a 10/9 suspension over the bass, and really what we have here is less of a suspension and more of just counterpoint going on. Actually, let's take a look at what's happening here. We have no, that would be a 5/4 suspension. It could be a lower suspension underneath. That's probably what it is. It's like a lower, like a 2/3 suspension underneath the melody. I do think this is a 1 chord of sorts, but interestingly, what ends up happening here is we have D sharp and F sharp with A, which is clearly implying a 7/5, but because we have this E suspended in, or just sustained, I guess, it's not even really suspended because it doesn't function that way. It's being sustained for 2.5 beats here. It's not really entirely intact. It's something worth mentioning because we have the secondary leading tone here resolves the way we would expect. The tenor line clearly looks like we're in the key of E major, and the rest of the voices support it to a certain extent, but not enough context on the page for me to analyze this as a 7 chord going on here. If you're someone who wants to be more granular, go for it, 7/5. But then we get E, E, G sharp, and E, which is our 5 chord. Again, oh, and apologies, this would be a 1/6/4 chord. And the reason why I feel like this is a 1/6/4 chord, even with the G sharp going on here, because we have C sharp, G sharp, and A, this G sharp I feel like is kind of a, what is the word? A decoy, or a false, false positive means something else. What am I trying to say? It's kind of like a decoy. It's pointing us in a direction, right? Because we have A, G sharp going to F sharp. Perhaps we would expect another deceptive progression here, but the D sharp also creates conflict there. So we have the makings of an F sharp minor chord, we have the makings of a D sharp diminished chord, we have the makings of an A major chord. I'm just going to call this some type of one chord. The bass is being held over. I feel like Bach is preparing for a cadence. Whether you analyze this as 1-6-4, whether you analyze this as 6-7 over E, it's entirely up to you, but there's some counterpoint going on here, and the chords are actually quite difficult to pick out what exactly is going on. It's much easier to articulate with words. But we do have a passing tone, or set of passing tones, in the bass and the alto before we get G sharp, E, B, and E. That's just taking our 5 chord, putting it in first inversion, and it kind of gets put in root position here, but again, the chord is not entirely intact by the time we see this E in the bass, and this D is a passing 7th. So looking ahead, we do get our resolution. We have A, E, B, and C sharp. I'm pretty convinced that this is a tonic triad, but if you look at this B as a suspension and look towards this E as our ornament, we have G sharp, C sharp, E, and C sharp. You could also analyze this as a 3-6-4 chord if you really feel like that B takes away from the legitimacy of the A major chord, but I honestly liken it to the G sharp, right? We had 2 A major chords that are being delayed in terms of their occurrence. I feel like one of the motives of this chorale has been the fact that we see delayed resolutions. Bach has been giving us some altered resolutions where we don't see the chord that we would expect on the other side all throughout this chorale. Granted, that doesn't happen with everything, but we have a phrase that's built pretty much entirely on secondary deceptive progressions. We have this interesting, not even secondary deceptive progression in traditional terms going on here, but a non-resolving or an unresolved secondary dominant here. We start off on 6. Lots of interesting chord progressions in this chorale, but I do feel like a tonic triad's being implied here. It's pretty obvious, especially after a 5 chord. And then we get G sharp, C sharp, E, and C sharp, and I will call that 3-6-4, kind of like a substitute for 7. And then we have F sharp, A, and D. That is 4-6, D major over F sharp. And then we have a passing tone in the bass. This A is a chord tone, so we don't need to mark it. This C sharp is not as a passing 7th, so we have E, C sharp, A, and C sharp. That's another 6-4 chord, 1-6-4. And I don't think this is a case of a 1-6-4 chord being interrupted as well. I do feel like this 1-6-4 is largely coincidental. It's just a passing tonic 6-4 chord. And then we get our predominant D, F sharp, A, and B, which is B minor 7 over D. We know that Bach loves 2-6-5 chords, especially in cadential situations. This B is a chord tone. This D is a chord tone. This is probably the closest version of taking a chord and inverting it to root position on the offbeat, but we're getting rid of the 5th of the chord in the process, and my rule still stands. If it's not entirely intact, or there's not a compelling enough reason to justify that turning of the chord from an inversion to another inversion, or in this case root position, it's not going to make it on the page, but do know that that is what's going on. We have E, B, G sharp, and B, which is our 5 chord, which is what we would expect after a 2-6-5 chord, and we don't end on a deceptive cadence like perhaps we would expect here. We end on a perfect authentic cadence, A major, A, C sharp, E, and A, which is our tonic triad in the key of A, ending a very quirky chorale, very interesting. Lots of progressions that don't go where they're supposed to go. It's very interesting. I don't really see anywhere in the text that suggests that, deception or going places where we wouldn't expect is something that would be expected. But in the case of this chorale taken out of the context of the text, lots of interesting stuff going on, lots of things to go into my notes for this one, and apologies again for the chopped up nature of the video. I saw a pretty big error in the way that I had analyzed the second phrase, and I wanted to make sure that that was presented accurately, of course, because I want all my analysis to be as accurate as I possibly can. But if you spot any inconsistencies or anything incorrect that differs from your analysis, please post it in the comment section. I would love your feedback, and to start a conversation. That would be awesome. But on that note, if you're interested in following this journey to analyze all of Bach's chorale harmonizations, feel free to subscribe to the channel. You could also hit the notification icon as well if you are interested in getting a daily notification about my upload schedule. But also, if you are, please like the video as well if you liked the video. That was a tip that I received from one of my friends, something I've been trying to incorporate into my outro, but I've not been very successful at it, or at least I've been inconsistent. Not 100%, and I'm striving for 100%. So like the video if you enjoyed the content. It means that my videos will be seen by more people, and it helps the channel grow, which is something that the channel's been doing, and that is awesome. But with all of that being said, thank you so much for watching the video. Thank you so much for supporting the channel by doing so. I look forward to tomorrow's analysis, and I hope you take care.